In this lesson, we're going to discuss SQL injection attacks. Now, before we dive into SQL injection attacks, though, we need to talk a little bit about SQL in general and provide some background. Now, when you're dealing with databases, you have to have a way to talk to the database in order to read, write, or search for data within that database. This is done using statements in the structured query language, more commonly referred to as SQL. Now, there are four main actions in SQL that are used to manipulate data within a database. These four actions are select, insert, delete, or update. Now, to select something means that we want to read data from the database. To insert something means we want to write that data into the database. To delete something means we want to remove that data from the database. And to update something means I want to overwrite data that's already in the database with a newer version. Now, let's take a quick look at how SQL works in the real world. When you try to log into a website, you may encounter a basic login form asking you for your username and password. Let's pretend I enter Jason as my username and pass123 as my password, and then click Login. Next, the website will send my username and password over to the database and make a query to determine if my username and password match what's already stored in the database. To do this, we're going to use an SQL statement. For example, it might say select star from users where user ID equals Jason and password equals pass123. Now, this information goes over to the database, and the database is going to compare it to determine if we have a match. If we do, we're going to get access granted and everything is wonderful. But if we don't, we're going to get access denied, and then we can't log into the server. Now, this is a very basic and major oversimplification of how SQL really works. If you're a database engineer, I know I made this much simpler than it really is. But this is really the baseline knowledge that everybody watching this video needs to have before we can move forward and talk about SQL injections. So please don't send me a bunch of hate mail over my oversimplification here. All right, now let's move into a code injection. Now, a code injection is the insertion of additional information or code through a data input form that a client takes and then sends it to an application. Code injection is really a generic form, but what we really want to focus on here is an SQL injection in this lesson, because that's how an attacker is going to insert malicious SQL statements into our application and cause a lot of havoc for us. Now, an SQL injection attack consists of the injection of an SQL query through the input form that a client uses to send data to a web application. When you're conducting an SQL injection, the attacker is going to be trying to insert parameters or code into the SQL statement that's going to be used to query that database. To do this, the attacker can inject their input as a URL parameter by entering data into form fields, modifying cookies, changing post data, or even using HTTP headers to find an SQL injection vulnerability. While this sounds like a lot of work, it really is easy to automate this process as an attacker because there are many great tools out there that focus on SQL injections and exploits. So, as a defender, it is our job to protect our databases from SQL injections. And to do that, we have to understand how SQL injections actually work. So, let's go back to our example of logging into a website and see how the SQL injection could exploit our site. First, we have the login form used by our clients to enter their username and password. As an attacker, I'm going to put in the user that I want to log in as, in this case Jason, and then I'm going to insert the password. But I don't know the password of pass123 because I don't know Jason's password. So I'm simply going to put in an apostrophe or 1 = 1 semicolon. Now, I know that looks a bit weird, right? But what I'm doing here is actually going to be injecting that code when I hit the login button. That takes the data from the form and inserts it into the SQL statement on the back end. So now we have the command that says select star from users where user ID equals Jason and password equals apostrophe apostrophe or 1 = 1 semicolon apostrophe. Notice when I sent that to the system, I'm going to get that into the system and it's going to say access granted. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is because I just performed an SQL injection. What actually ended up happening here is that we inserted something like an apostrophe that served as an escape character. So what I did was actually injected everything after the apostrophe into the SQL statement that the system was going to evaluate. And so instead of saying entering the password pass123, I'm saying, tell me, does the password for Jason match the password for Jason or does 1 = 1? Now, let me ask you a quick question. Does 1 = 1? Yes, 1 = 1, right? Every single day, it's going to be a true statement. So anytime we run this command, we're doing Boolean logic to find out is it a true or false statement. And the true statement is always going to be returned as true when checking this password because even if we don't have the right password for Jason, 1 always equals 1. And this was an OR statement using Boolean logic. So even if the password was wrong, we still have it. And in this case, we entered a blank password or 1 equals 1. And therefore, we're able to see that our password, even though it doesn't match the database, still gets a true statement because the OR condition has 1 equals 1, which is always true. This way, the SQL statement overall returns a true and we get access into the system. This is why preventing SQL injections is so important, because anytime you can create a true statement, you're going to be able to log right into the database. So, what is the best way to prevent an SQL injection? Well, the single best way to prevent an SQL injection is to use input validation and sanitize any input received from your users. Now, for the exam, anytime you see something with an apostrophe and a something equals something, I want you to instantly think that the answer has to do with an SQL injection attempt. Every single time. Be aware, the log entry they show you doesn't have to be 1 equals 1 though. It can be anything that has a true statement. 7 equals 7, 15 equals 15, A equals A, whatever, it doesn't matter. As long as the statement will always return true, this is a form of SQL injection. I guarantee you on the exam, you're going to get at least a few questions on identifying SQL injections. This is a common topic they love to ask about because it's really important. So, if you're asked about an SQL injection and how to prevent it, what is the right answer? Input validation. If you can validate or sanitize the input, you can prevent an SQL injection from occurring because you can simply filter out those apostrophes or something equals something statements from the input the user gave you. Another great way to prevent an SQL injection is to place a web application firewall between the client and the server, since the web application firewall can perform input sanitization for you if you can't rewrite the application code yourself because you don't own the application. Another clue to a question asking about SQL injections is if the question involves a database, because the most common attack against a database is going to be an SQL injection. Remember all these tricks when you get to exam day? They are really going to come in handy, I promise.